Nobody expected that when the paramedic pressed 2 fingers to my wrist, he would lock eyes with his partner and say, "Get the gurney," and that my mother-in-law would still be standing in the doorway of her dining room, arms crossed, saying I was just trying to get out of doing the dishes. But let me take you back to the Thursday before Thanksgiving, because that is where this story really begins. I had been feeling wrong for about 4 days by then. Not sick the way you call in to work sick. Wrong in a quieter, more frightening way, like my body was sending messages in a language I could almost read, but not quite. My legs felt heavy the moment I woke up, the kind of heavy that does not go away after coffee. My chest had a dull ache that I kept dismissing as tension because my mother-in-law, Patricia, had been texting me daily about the seating chart and whether I was making the green bean casserole from scratch or, God forbid, from a can. My husband, Daniel, noticed I was moving slowly on Monday morning. He asked if I was okay. I told him I was tired. He nodded and went to make his breakfast, and I do not blame him for that. I had spent 3 years in his family learning that when a woman in their house says she is tired, the correct response is to suggest she go to bed earlier. Complaints about the body were treated like complaints about the weather, acknowledged briefly, then ignored because there was nothing to be done and also because there was always something more pressing on the calendar. His family was not cruel, exactly. They were practical in the way that some families are practical. Emotions were inefficient, sickness was inconvenient, and pushing through was the highest virtue a person could demonstrate. Patricia had raised Daniel and his 2 brothers on that philosophy after their father left, and she wore it like a badge. She had worked 2 jobs with a herniated disc for 6 years and never once called out. She reminded us of this regularly. I had grown up in a warmer house, where my own mother took my temperature at the first sign of a sniffle and kept children's Tylenol stocked like a pantry staple. Marrying into Daniel's family felt, at times, like emigrating to a country with completely different customs around pain. I had spent years trying to assimilate. I had learned to say "I'm fine" before anyone could ask. By Tuesday, the heaviness in my legs had crept upward. There was a tightness in my lower left calf that I kept pressing with my thumb as if I could work it loose like a knot in a muscle. I mentioned it to Daniel that night while we were loading the dishwasher. He glanced down at my leg, then back at the dishes. "Did you stretch today?" he asked. I said no, probably not enough. "Probably just from sitting at your desk," he said. And he was not wrong. I worked from home, long hours, and poor posture. I filed the calf pain under probably nothing and went to bed. Wednesday, I drove to the grocery store to pick up ingredients for the casserole and the cranberry sauce I had promised to bring. I had to sit on the bench near the entrance for a few minutes before I felt steady enough to push the cart. An older woman asked if I needed help. I smiled and told her I had just been on my feet all morning. I drove home with the windows down even though it was 38 degrees outside because the cold air was the only thing that felt real. That night I told Daniel I thought I might be coming down with something. His brother, Garrett, and Garrett's wife, Sandra, were arriving from Columbus the next morning, and Patricia had already sent a group text reminding everyone that Thanksgiving was at her house at 2 o'clock and that she needed people there by noon to help set up. Daniel looked at me with a particular expression I had come to recognize over 3 years of marriage. It was not unsympathetic, but it was already calculating. "Do you think you'll be okay by tomorrow?" he asked. I said I thought so. "My mom's going to need help with the tables," he said. I said I knew. I went to sleep telling myself that tomorrow I would feel better. That is the thing about being dismissed for long enough. Eventually you start dismissing yourself. You stop trusting the signals because every time you have raised the alarm in this family, someone has quietly explained why it was a false alarm, and after a while you internalize the lesson. You learn to wait for permission to be sick. Thanksgiving morning, I woke up and I knew something was not right in a way that went beyond tired and beyond calf pain. My heart was beating faster than it should have been, doing nothing, just lying in bed. When I stood up, the room did a slow tilt. I sat back down on the edge of the mattress and breathed through it. Daniel was already in the shower. I went to the bathroom mirror and looked at my face. I was pale in a way that did not look like poor sleep. My lips had a slightly grayish tint that I stared at for a long time before deciding I was probably being dramatic because of the lighting. I put on makeup. I got dressed. I packed the casserole and the cranberry sauce into the car. Patricia's house was 20 minutes away, a colonial on a tree-lined street that always looked like a Christmas card. When we pulled into the driveway, Garrett's car was already there. I could hear Sandra laughing inside before we even opened the front door, and something about the sound of normal life already in progress made me want to sit down on the porch steps and stay there. Inside, Patricia was directing the kitchen like a general. She had the turkey out, she had her lists, she had Sandra chopping celery and Garrett carrying the extra folding chairs up from the basement. She looked at me when I came in, and her eyes did a quick scan the way they always did, efficient, assessing. "You look tired," she said. "I'm okay," I said. "Just a little off." "There's coffee," she said, already turning back to the stove. I set my dishes on the counter and tried to be useful. I arranged rolls in a basket. I folded napkins. I filled water glasses. Each task took more out of me than it should have, and I kept finding excuses to lean against the counter, to stand near a wall, to position myself somewhere that I could catch myself if my legs decided to stop cooperating. Around 11:30, Daniel's youngest brother, Kevin, arrived with his girlfriend, and Patricia put me in charge of showing them where to hang their coats and where to set the extra wine. I walked to the entryway and my left leg, the one with the calf pain, buckled slightly on the bottom stair. I caught the banister. Kevin looked at me. "You okay?" he asked. "Totally," I said. "Clumsy." He smiled and I smiled, and I pointed them toward the coat closet and walked back to the kitchen, holding the wall of the hallway with my fingertips. At 12:15, Patricia asked me to help her carry the leaf for the dining room table up from the basement. I started to say I could do it, and then the words came out slower than I intended, and Sandra looked at me with her head tilted. "Are you feeling all right?" Sandra asked. She said it quietly, just to me, and something in me cracked open a little, because she had asked it like she meant it, not as a logistical question, not calculating whether I was going to be useful, but actually asking. I felt my eyes sting. I blinked it back. "I don't feel great," I said just as quietly. "My chest has been a little tight." Sandra's expression shifted. "How long?" "Few days," I said. She started to say something else, but Patricia came around the corner asking about the table leaf, and the moment closed like a door. I spent the next hour sitting whenever I could find a reason to sit. I helped Patricia transfer things from pots to serving dishes. I smiled through conversations. I answered questions about work and about whether Daniel and I had any travel plans for Christmas. I ate approximately 4 bites of turkey and a small amount of stuffing before I realized that eating was requiring concentration I didn't have. It was Patricia who first said it. She had asked me to help clear the first round of dishes, and I had stood up from my chair and then stood there for a moment because the room had tilted again and I needed it to stop. She was watching me from the other end of the table. "You're not going to pass out on me, are you?" she said. The tone was light. "A joke. I'm okay," I said. "Because if you're feeling sick, I'd rather you not spread it around the whole table," she said, and there was something underneath the lightness that wasn't quite a joke anymore. "I'm not contagious," I said. "I just feel a little—" "She's been like this all morning," Daniel said, to no one in particular, with the particular weariness of someone who had been waiting for this to become everyone else's problem. "I noticed," Patricia said. "Honestly, sweetheart, if you need to go lie down in the guest room, just go. You don't have to be a martyr about it, but you also don't have to perform being sick at the dinner table." I stood there with a stack of salad plates in my hands, and I heard what she said, and I heard what she meant, and they were not the same thing. What she said was that I could go rest. What she meant was that this was inconvenient and a little embarrassing, and she would prefer I take it somewhere private. "I'm fine," I said. I carried the plates to the kitchen. Sandra followed me in. She came up next to me at the sink and spoke low. "You are not fine. I'm looking at you right now, and you are not fine. How tight is your chest?" I turned on the faucet so no one would hear. "It comes and goes," I said. "My left leg has been hurting for a few days, and this morning I noticed my heart was going kind of fast. And I stopped. I probably just need water." Sandra put her hand on my arm. "Do you have any swelling in that leg?" I looked at her. "A little. Why?" She said very carefully and very quietly, "I need you to come sit down." She walked me into the small sitting room off the kitchen, the room no one used at Thanksgiving because it had the uncomfortable chairs, and she sat across from me, and she said, "I'm a physical therapist. I'm not a doctor, But what you're describing, leg pain, leg swelling, chest tightness, fast heart rate, shortness of breath, I need you to call 911 right now, or I'm doing it for you. I stared at her. It's Thanksgiving. I know, she said. Patricia is going to… I don't care, Sandra said, and her voice was very steady. Do you want me to make the call? I don't know what I would have decided, because at that moment my body decided for me. The tightness in my chest went from a background hum to something sharp and sudden, and I made a sound I did not intend to make, not a scream, more like a gasp that came from somewhere involuntary, and Sandra was already on the phone before I finished making it. What happened next is something I know partly from memory and partly from what people told me afterward, because parts of it are missing from my recall the way a conversation is missing when you've fallen asleep in the middle of it. I remember Daniel coming into the sitting room and stopping in the doorway. I remember his face doing something complicated. I remember Patricia appearing behind him and saying, very sharply, "What is going on?" And I remember, with a clarity that I will carry for the rest of my life, that her first expression was not worry. It was irritation. "Is this really necessary?" she said. "She's been fine all morning, she is not fine," Sandra said. "She has anxiety," Patricia said, and the word landed flat and certain, the way she said everything as if she had already done the research and closed the case. "She's worked herself up. Daniel, tell her." "I don't have anxiety," I said from the chair. Or I think I said it. I'm not entirely sure I said it out loud. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. I know it was 8 minutes because I found out later that Sandra had watched the clock. The paramedics came in and they checked my pulse and they checked my blood pressure, and one of them said something to the other that I couldn't hear, and then one of them crouched down in front of me and said, "Ma'am, we're going to need to take you in." Patricia said from somewhere behind him, "Is that really?" "Ma'am," the paramedic said. "Not to me. I need you to step back, please." The last thing I clearly saw before they got me onto the gurney was Patricia standing in the doorway of her sitting room with her arms crossed and an expression that I can only describe as affronted, as if I had organized this, personally to ruin her Thanksgiving, and Daniel standing just behind her, looking at me with an expression I could not read at all. Sandra rode with me in the ambulance. At the hospital, they ran a CT scan and a blood test called a dimer, and the emergency physician came in and told me, with the particular calm of someone who delivers frightening news regularly, that I had a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in my lung, and that the swelling and pain in my calf was a deep vein thrombosis. The clot had originated there and traveled. She said it was significant. She said they were admitting me immediately. She said that if I had gone to bed that night without coming in, the outcome the next morning might have been very different. I asked her to say that second part again, because I needed to hear it once more to believe it. She said it again. Sandra was sitting in the chair beside the bed. She reached over and took my hand without saying anything, and I started crying in the ugly, uncontrolled way that I had spent 3 years training myself not to do in front of Daniel's family. Daniel arrived at the hospital at some point during my 3rd hour in the ER. He came in and stood at the foot of my bed and looked at the IV in my arm and the monitor on my finger, and his face had finally arrived at something that looked like fear. Too late to have been useful, but fear nonetheless. The doctor said it was a blood clot, he said. Yes, I said. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't know it was that serious. I looked at him. I told you my chest was tight. I told you my leg hurt. I told you for 4 days. I thought you were, he stopped. You thought I was what? I asked. He didn't answer. He sat down in the chair on the other side of the bed, and he looked at the floor, and I let the silence sit there because I did not have the energy to fill it and I was not sure I wanted to. Patricia came to the hospital on Friday morning. She came with a container of homemade soup, which I found both touching and infuriating in equal measure, because a container of soup was the kind of thing you brought when someone had the flu, and I had come within hours of not being alive, and those did not feel like the same category of event. She sat in the chair by my bed and she looked at the IV and the monitors and the compression stockings the nurses had put on my legs, and for a long time she did not say anything. Then she said, "I didn't realize." "I know," I said. "I thought you were anxious. You do get anxious," and I thought, "I know what you thought," I said. She was quiet again. Then, the paramedic told Daniel that if it had been another few hours… "I know," I said. "I'm sorry," she said. She said it the way she said most things, practically, without excessive decoration. But she said it and she did not follow it with a qualification or a reason or an explanation that shifted the weight of it. She just said it and let it land. I told her I appreciated that she said it. I told her I needed some time before I could figure out what our relationship looked like on the other side of this. She nodded, once, the way she nodded when she had received information she intended to actually process. Garrett came that afternoon. He shook his head slowly when he saw me and said, "Jesus, we didn't know." I told him I understood. He looked guilty in a way that I think was genuine. Kevin came with his girlfriend and they brought flowers. His girlfriend, who I had met exactly twice, sat at the edge of my bed and said, "I knew something was wrong with you when you grabbed the wall in the hallway." And I almost laughed, because this woman I barely knew had clocked it, and no one who had known me for years had allowed themselves to see it. Daniel and I had the real conversation on Saturday. After his family had cleared out, and it was just us in my hospital room with the monitors beeping and the gray November light coming through the window, he told me he had been thinking about it for 2 days. He told me he knew that his family had a way of not taking things seriously, that had been useful when they were all surviving lean years, but that it had a cost, and that the cost had landed on me, and that was not something he could explain away. He said the words, "I am sorry," in a way that I believed, though I also knew that sorry was a beginning and not an ending. I told him what I had been carrying for 3 years. I told him that I had learned to not trust my own body because every time I mentioned something in his family's presence, someone found a reason that it wasn't real, and that after long enough I had started finding those reasons myself. I told him I had sat in a grocery store parking lot on Wednesday, barely able to stand, and I had gone in and bought the cranberry sauce anyway because I was afraid of being called dramatic. He did not defend himself. He just listened. That was the right thing to do. I was in the hospital for 4 days. The blood thinners worked. The clot was resolving. The doctor told me I was one of the lucky ones, which was a phrase I turned over in my hands like a coin because lucky implied chance, and chance implied that it could easily have gone differently, and I was aware in a way I had not been before of how close to differently I had come. When I went home different, not healed in the simple sense. There was still the work of anticoagulants and follow-up appointments and learning not to flinch every time I felt something in my chest. There was still the work of figuring out how to be in a marriage where the person I loved had to unlearn something fundamental about how he dealt with other people's pain. There was still the work of navigating a relationship with Patricia, who had said sorry and meant it, and who was also still Patricia, still practical, still brisk, still instinctively reaching for dismissal before she caught herself. But I went home different in this way. I had stopped waiting for permission to be taken seriously. That winter, I started seeing a therapist. Not because I had anxiety, I'm very clear on that point, but because I had 3 years of conditioning to undo, and I did not want to do it alone. She was the one who gave me the language for what had happened. She said the word gaslighting, and I resisted it at first because it felt too large, too clinical for what had been most of the time, just a family with a particular set of habits. But she pointed out that the impact is the impact regardless of the intent, and that a person who has been taught not to trust her own pain is a person who will sit in a chair at Thanksgiving ignoring a blood clot in her lung, and that this was not a small thing. In March, I had coffee with Sandra, just the 2 of us, which we had never done before. We sat in a place downtown with good light, and she ordered an oat milk latte and I ordered a plain coffee, and we talked for 3 hours. She told me she had known within minutes of looking at me that morning that something was not right. She said she had been running through the checklist in her head: leg pain, swelling, chest tightness, rapid heart rate, and that every item on the list had been ticking. She said she'd wanted to say something earlier, but she had been waiting for the right moment, and then she'd realized there wasn't going to be a right moment, there was only the moment that was happening. I told her that she had saved my life. She shook her head. She said I had saved my own life because I hadn't fought her on the phone call. I thought about that for a while. I thought about all the ways I could have talked myself out of it, all the voices I had internalized that would have told me I was being dramatic, that it was Thanksgiving, that Patricia was going to be upset, that the ambulance was for people who were actually sick. I thought about how close I had come to letting those voices win. I still think about the woman I was on that Thursday morning. Standing in the bathroom, looking at my gray face in the mirror, putting on makeup. I want to reach back through time and put my hand on her shoulder. I want to tell her that the voice in her head that says you are not sick enough to matter is not her voice. It was given to her, one dismissal at a time, by people who were running from their own discomfort. I want to tell her that her body was trying to save her life, and that listening to it was not weakness, and that needing help was not performance. If you have been told, once or 100 times, that your pain is inconvenient or exaggerated or a symptom of something other than what you know it to be, I am talking to you. You know your body. You have always known. The people who told you otherwise were wrong, and it was not your job to keep the peace at the expense of your own life. I'm still here. I almost wasn't. And I will not be quiet about the difference.